The tanker was just 20 minutes away from the enforcement boundary when it made its move. There was no warning, no radio transmission, no request for authorization. The vessel, identified as the Rich Starry, simply shifted its heading, pushed its engines harder, and advanced directly toward the U.S. Navy's control corridor in the Strait of Hormuz, as if the blockade did not exist. On the bridge of an American warship, every display lit up at the same instant. What unfolded over the next few minutes sent a signal that traveled from Washington to Beijing to Tehran. Not because of the cargo on board, not because of its destination, but because of who had dispatched it, and because of what happened when the most powerful naval force ever assembled in that strait reacted instantly, decisively, and without hesitation. China had just tested the blockade, and the United States had just answered that test. But here is what almost nobody is telling you about that moment. The tanker turning away was not the most important part of what happened. The real significance lies in what it revealed about a confrontation that has been building for years. Beneath trade agreements, beneath official diplomatic statements, beneath carefully constructed messaging coming out of Beijing, for the first time in decades, the gap between what China claims it can do and what it can actually execute was exposed in public, in real time, on one of the most closely watched waterways on the planet. And the consequences of that exposure go far beyond a single tanker reversing course. Stay with me, because what is unfolding in the Strait of Hormuz right now is not just a story about Iran. It is a story about the real limits of Chinese power, and the world is about to find out exactly where those limits are. To understand why a tanker turning around matters as much as it does, you need to understand what was built between Beijing and Tehran over the last 15 years. Because the U.S. blockade did not just stop Iranian oil exports, it severed a strategic relationship that both countries had spent years constructing, and one that China had come to depend on in ways that extend far beyond price per barrel. China is Iran's largest trading partner, and by far its most important oil customer. But the relationship goes deeper than commerce. Iran provided China with access to Middle Eastern geography through Belt and Road infrastructure projects, most importantly through the port of Chabahar, which offered Beijing a transit route that bypassed traditional trade corridors influenced by the United States. In return, China provided Iran with something equally valuable: technology, infrastructure, diplomatic protection in international forums, and perhaps most importantly, a shadow fleet of tankers moving Iranian crude into Chinese refineries in defiance of Western sanctions. That system allowed the Islamic Republic to remain economically functional through years of maximum pressure that might otherwise have crippled it completely. Together, the two countries built a system, a continuous flow of oil, money, and strategic protection, operating largely outside the frameworks controlled by Washington. Iran needed Chinese demand to survive economically. China needed Iranian oil to remain affordable and its Middle Eastern foothold to remain geopolitically relevant. And then, on April 13, 2026, the United States Navy shut that entire system down in a single morning. Karg Island, the core of Iran's oil export infrastructure, through which roughly 90% of its crude flows, locked. Chabahar, China's carefully cultivated alternative gateway, locked. Bandar Abbas, the primary maritime entry and exit point for nearly everything moving in and out of Iran, locked. Every channel through which Beijing had been purchasing discounted, sanctioned Iranian oil was sealed at the same time. The Iranian segment of the Belt and Road became operationally useless overnight. Billions of dollars in Chinese infrastructure investment were effectively stranded. The diplomatic shield Beijing had provided Tehran through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization became irrelevant because the problem was no longer diplomatic, it was military. 3 carrier strike groups, more than 15 warships, continuous air patrols, submarine coverage below the surface, a level of control that China had no realistic way to contest in that environment. 190 million barrels of Iranian oil already loaded, left stranded at sea with nowhere to go. A strategic bridge built over years, cut in a single morning. But even that was not the moment that fully revealed the depth of China's problem. That moment came when Beijing decided to test whether the blockade was real. The tanker Rich Starry approached the enforcement corridor. It made its move. Within 20 minutes it turned back. 2 more tankers, Austria and at least 1 additional vessel, repeated the same maneuver shortly afterward. 3 Chinese-linked tankers reversed course before reaching their destination. No shots fired, no confrontation, no standoff, just a turn and a message understood. China's defense minister, Admiral Dong Jun, stepped forward publicly and delivered statements designed to project strength. He said Chinese vessels had transited Hormuz. He said China maintained agreements with Iran. He said the United States should not interfere in Chinese affairs. Strong words, commanding words, broadcast across Chinese state media, circulated through diplomatic channels worldwide. And yet, not a single ship was protected by those words. Not one tanker passed through the corridor under the protection China implied it could provide. The gap between statement and reality became visible to every navy, every intelligence service, and every government watching this crisis unfold. And that gap is exactly where the most dangerous calculation of this entire conflict now exists. China's problem is not just the loss of Iranian oil. That alone is manageable, at least in the short term. China holds approximately 130 days of strategic petroleum reserves. It can draw them down. It can secure alternative suppliers at higher prices. It can absorb the immediate disruption, painfully, but effectively. The real problem is Hormuz itself, and the numbers explain exactly why. China imports more than 10 million barrels of oil every single day, almost entirely by sea. Roughly 40% of that supply passes through the Strait of Hormuz, not just from Iran, but from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, the UAE, Kuwait, and Qatar. Combined, that means approximately half of China's seaborne oil supply depends on that one waterway remaining open. As long as the U.S. Navy controls the strait, China's energy security is directly exposed to American decisions. That is not an acceptable strategic reality for a country that has spent 2 decades presenting itself as a rising global power capable of operating independently of American-dominated systems. It is not acceptable for an economy whose industrial base, manufacturing capacity, and political stability all depend on reliable and affordable energy. And it is not acceptable for a political system whose legitimacy depends on delivering continuous economic growth. This is why the rich Starry's U-turn matters far beyond the oil it was carrying. It marked the moment when China's claim to peer competitor status with the United States was tested in the real world and came up short. So what does Beijing do now? This is where the crisis enters its most dangerous phase, because China has options, and none of them are good. So what does Beijing do now? This is where the crisis enters its most dangerous phase, because China does have options, but none of them come without serious consequences. The first option is direct military confrontation. Could China deploy naval forces into the Strait of Hormuz and attempt to break the blockade by force? In theory, yes. China maintains an overseas military base in Djibouti, positioned along the East African coast. Over the past decade, the People's Liberation Army Navy has expanded significantly. Its growing network of ports, stretching from the Horn of Africa across the Indian Ocean toward the Persian Gulf, provides logistical infrastructure that could support extended operations. But Hormuz is not a controlled testing environment. It is a fully contested and tightly monitored battle space. Facing the current American deployment, 3 carrier strike groups anchored by the USS Abraham Lincoln, the USS Gerald R. Ford, and the USS George H.W. Bush, supported by more than 15 warships, continuous combat air patrols conducted by F-35C and FA-18 fighters, P-8 Poseidon aircraft scanning the surface, submarines operating beneath, and over 50,000 U.S. military personnel in the region, China would be entering at a severe disadvantage. Any attempt by a Chinese warship to force the blockade line would immediately trigger direct military confrontation between 2 nuclear-armed powers at sea. The last time the world experienced a dynamic remotely comparable to this was in 1962, when Soviet vessels approached a U.S. naval blockade around Cuba. That moment is remembered as the closest the world has ever come to nuclear war. Military analysts observing the current situation are invoking that comparison deliberately. China is not in a position to take that risk, not with tensions over Taiwan already elevated, not with its economy already under pressure from tariffs and slowing growth, and not in a theater where American military superiority is overwhelming and unambiguous. The second option is one China has mastered in a very different environment, the use of gray zone tactics. This involves deploying Coast Guard vessels instead of naval warships, utilizing maritime militia or fishing fleets instead of formal military assets, creating presence without crossing the threshold into open conflict. Beijing could attempt to escort commercial tankers using Coast Guard vessels, establishing a form of non-military convoy through the strait. But this strategy works in environments like the South China Sea, where the opposing forces are regional actors with limited escalation capacity. It does not work in Hormuz. not against 3 American carrier strike groups. If China attempts to push a gray zone convoy through and the United States stops it, the result is immediate and highly visible. China's bluff is exposed in front of the entire world. And with it, the narrative Beijing has spent years constructing, that of a multipolar world where American dominance can be challenged, begins to collapse in a single, undeniable moment. The third option is the domain where China traditionally excels: diplomatic and economic pressure. Beijing holds a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council, with veto power over any resolution. It can block attempts to legitimize the blockade internationally. It can build opposition by aligning with Iran's position regarding conditional passage rights. It can escalate the ongoing trade conflict with the United States. It can reduce holdings of U.S. Treasury assets. It can weaponize supply chains in sectors where China holds dominant market share. But none of these measures reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Diplomatic processes operate on timelines measured in months or years. Chinese refineries operate on timelines measured in days and weeks. A veto at the United Nations does not load oil into a tanker. And economic retaliation, while real, cuts in both directions. Escalating trade tensions further damages the Chinese economy at precisely the moment it is already absorbing the shock created by the blockade. The fourth option is the one China is actively pursuing: wait, calculate, absorb damage while ensuring that competitors absorb more. China has already halted exports of gasoline and diesel, tightening supply for countries like Japan and South Korea, both of which rely on Chinese refined fuel exports. At the same time, Beijing has resumed purchasing American liquefied natural gas, reopening imports that had been suspended during the trade dispute. This is not accidental. It is an attempt to create leverage through selective economic engagement. Even as military pressure increases, China is positioning itself as an essential supplier to Southeast Asian markets, scrambling for alternative fuel sources. It is expanding regional influence, even while its own energy position deteriorates. China is taking damage, but it is attempting to ensure that others take more. And for now, Beijing has calculated that patience carries less risk than escalation. The fifth option is the most long-term, and potentially the most consequential: building alternatives to Hormuz entirely. For years, China has invested heavily in infrastructure designed to bypass the strait. The most notable example is the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which runs through Pakistan to the port of Gwadar. In theory, this corridor allows Gulf oil to be transported overland directly into China, avoiding Hormuz altogether. The current crisis has demonstrated the strategic value of those investments with absolute clarity. But those alternatives are not yet capable of replacing Hormuz. They lack the capacity, they lack the scale, they are long-term solutions to an immediate crisis. They do not supply the oil that Chinese refineries require today. Every option comes at a significant cost. Beijing is calculating carefully, but it is not taking risks. And that gap between rhetoric and action is the most important strategic revelation of this crisis so far. On the American side, the force assembled around the Strait of Hormuz represents one of the most significant naval concentrations of modern times, and it continues to expand. The USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group is already operating at full combat readiness within the region. The USS Gerald R. Ford Strike Group is positioned in the Mediterranean, within rapid response distance. A third carrier group, led by the USS George H.W. Bush, is moving toward the theater. When it arrives, the United States will have 3 full carrier strike groups deployed simultaneously within a single operational zone. More than 50,000 military personnel, dozens of the most advanced surface combatants ever constructed, continuous air superiority maintained around the clock, submarine presence beneath the surface. There is no comparable naval force anywhere near the Strait of Hormuz. There is no force China could deploy into the region that would match this concentration of power. There is no combination of Iranian fast attack craft, coastal missile systems, or proxy drone capabilities that would create a credible conventional threat against this level of American military presence. But American power at Hormuz is not without limits, and understanding those limits is essential to understanding how this crisis could ultimately unfold. Maintaining 3 carrier strike groups in a single theater for an extended period places immense strain on logistics. Aircraft carriers require constant maintenance cycles. Personnel rotation schedules impose natural limits on sustained deployment. The resupply of ammunition and fuel for a force of this scale is itself a continuous and complex operation. And critically, every asset concentrated in Hormuz is an asset that cannot simultaneously be deployed elsewhere. not in the Taiwan Strait, not in the South China Sea, not in the Baltic region. Other potential flashpoints are observing this situation closely, and they are calculating accordingly. Allied support for the blockade has also been more limited than Washington may have initially anticipated. The United Arab Emirates and Bahrain have expressed support, but the United Kingdom has made it clear it will not directly participate in enforcement operations, instead focusing on mine-clearing activities and ensuring safe navigation. Germany and Australia have declined involvement. France is conducting a separate maritime mission alongside the United Kingdom, explicitly independent from the American operation. The United States is effectively managing one of the most consequential naval operations of the 21st century, largely on its own. And the blockade itself, while operationally effective, is not absolute. Tracking data indicates that multiple Iran-linked vessels have successfully transited the strait since enforcement began. Some of these vessels were already under U.S. sanctions. This suggests that Washington is making selective enforcement decisions, choosing which ships to intercept and which to allow passage. That selectivity reveals two things. First, the practical limits of enforcing a blockade across one of the busiest maritime corridors in the world. And second, the political calculations influencing every enforcement decision. The tanker Rich Starry turned back during its initial approach, but on a subsequent attempt, it successfully completed transit. The blockade is real, the blockade is functioning, but it is not impenetrable. And that gap, between declared policy and operational reality, is exactly where China is testing, probing, and applying pressure on a daily basis. Iran's position within this situation has undergone a transformation so profound that it would have been nearly unimaginable just months earlier. For decades, Iranian military doctrine rested on a single strategic principle: the ability to close the Strait of Hormuz. That capability acted as both deterrent and leverage. The threat alone was often enough to discourage military action. The actual execution of that threat provided Iran with influence over global markets. Hormuz was Iran's strategic weapon, its insurance policy against overwhelming conventional force. But that leverage has now been systematically dismantled. Iran's air defense network collapsed within the opening phase of the campaign. Coalition aircraft penetrated Iranian airspace, struck targets in central Tehran, and returned without loss. Facilities previously considered hardened or impenetrable were successfully targeted using advanced bunker-penetrating munitions. Naval infrastructure was severely degraded. Command structures were disrupted. Key personnel were eliminated. Logistical hubs were struck. Supply routes to allied groups in the region were interrupted. Iran executed its ultimate move, closing Hormuz. Oil prices surged. Global supply chains were disrupted. Energy markets were thrown into instability. And for a brief moment, Iran demonstrated that its deterrent was real. Then the United States responded, not by restoring the previous situation, but by fundamentally changing it. Instead of reopening the strait under Iranian influence, the United States removed that control entirely. Mines were cleared. A secure maritime corridor was established. Global trade resumed. But Iranian exports remained blocked. The strait is open, for everyone except Iran. Iran attempted to weaponize Hormuz. The United States responded by turning that weapon against it, opening the passage globally while locking Iran inside. A strategic reversal executed with overwhelming force. Iran's core leverage, neutralized and inverted. Iran's own strategic doctrine has now been turned against it. The very mechanism it relied on for decades has been reversed and applied with greater force. So what options does Tehran actually have left? In theory, several. In practice, almost none. Laying additional naval mines would require small vessels operating in waters now under constant surveillance, both from the air and from the sea. Any attempt to rebuild that capability would likely be detected and neutralized before it could have any meaningful effect. A conventional naval breakout from Iranian ports is no longer viable. With key naval infrastructure degraded and fast attack capabilities significantly reduced, any such attempt would face overwhelming opposition. Striking energy infrastructure across Gulf states would trigger immediate and unified retaliation. It would push countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE into full alignment against Iran, deepening its regional isolation beyond a point the regime could economically withstand. Activating proxy forces across multiple fronts, through Hezbollah in Lebanon or the Houthis in Yemen, would expand the conflict significantly. But doing so would also provide justification for a far broader military response. Every available option carries a cost that worsens Iran's position, and time is no longer on its side. Each day the blockade remains in place, the economic pressure intensifies. Oil storage capacity continues to fill. Revenue losses accumulate at an unsustainable rate. Production shutdown timelines approach, and domestic economic conditions, already fragile, move closer to a breaking point. Which brings us to the question that every government, every military command, every energy market, and every financial institution is asking at the same time. How does this end? At this moment, three potential outcomes are emerging. The first is diplomacy. Iran returns to negotiations with a revised proposal, built upon previous frameworks. The nuclear issue is addressed in a way that allows both sides to claim some level of success. China applies quiet pressure it does not acknowledge publicly, but which increases as its own energy security deteriorates. That pressure shifts the calculation. An agreement is reached. The blockade is lifted. The strait returns to normal operation under some form of international oversight. This is the outcome Washington is attempting to engineer. Every element of the current pressure campaign, the blockade, the economic strain, the tightening timelines, is designed to make this the most rational option. The second outcome is escalation. Iran expands the conflict. The Houthis disrupt the Bab el-Mandeb, the second most strategically important maritime choke point in the world. A Chinese-linked convoy attempts to challenge the blockade under quasi-military protection. A confrontation occurs, one that neither side fully controls. Negotiations collapse entirely. Military operations resume at a larger scale. Energy markets react violently. Oil prices surge to levels capable of triggering a global recession. The conflict spreads beyond its original boundaries. This is the scenario no actor claims to want, but it becomes more likely with every passing day that diplomacy fails to advance. The third outcome is a prolonged standoff. The blockade continues, but it does not force a rapid resolution. American logistical strain increases over time. Allied support remains limited. China continues probing the system, sending sanctioned vessels, testing enforcement, maintaining a limited but steady flow of Iranian oil that extends Tehran's timeline. The situation drags on. Economic damage accumulates across all sides. Global energy markets begin to reorganize around alternative routes and suppliers. Infrastructure investments accelerate, and the region remains locked in a state of unresolved tension. A slow, grinding crisis with no clear endpoint. History offers a reference point. In 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, Soviet vessels approached a U.S. naval blockade. At a certain moment, a decision was made. They turned back. That crisis ended because one side calculated that pushing forward carried a cost too high to justify. Today, in 2026, a similar equation is playing out. Different actors, different geography, different capabilities, but the same underlying logic. Military force establishes the boundary. Diplomacy is the only path to resolution. China's tankers turned around. Its leadership issued strong statements, but those statements did not protect a single vessel. Beijing is calculating carefully, but it is not crossing the line. And that restraint may be the most important factor determining how this situation evolves. Because in the end, the balance of power is not defined by what is said. It is defined by what is done. The distance between words and actions is where real power is measured. And in the Strait of Hormuz, that distance is being measured in real time. One tanker at a time, one decision at a time, one day at a time. As the pressure builds, as the timelines shorten, as the system moves closer to a moment that could reshape everything, Hormuz is no longer Iran's strategic weapon. It has become its constraint, and the world is watching, waiting to see who makes the next move.